Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Fugett. I want to welcome you to a personal revelation Bible study. This is the introduction. For those of you who will be joining me in this journey through the book of Revelation, I wanted to go ahead and put out an introductory study so that after Thanksgiving, we can go ahead and jump right into the book of Revelation itself. All right. So to begin with, I want to remind you that the Bible, something that we need to understand is that the Bible was written from a Jewish Eastern rather than a Western perspective. And what I mean by that is that Easterners tend to use a lot of symbols and tell stories to get their point across. Jesus did this quite often in telling parables, to his audience. And his audience would have understood their customs and idioms and style of writing much the way those of us today understand when someone says it's raining cats and dogs. We know that it's not literally raining cats and dogs, but that it's raining very hard. Now, the next thing I want you to understand is that the Bible was written for us and not to us. And this is a quote that AI, at least, contributed to John H. Walton. What this means is that the Bible was written for our benefit and instruction, but was not originally written to us as a contemporary audience. Instead, it was written to specific people in ancient times and cultures, and we must understand that ancient context to correctly apply the message to our lives today. This approach encourages readers to see the Bible as a window into God's relationship with humanity rather than a book that speaks directly into our modern circumstances. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't, that there aren't things that we can't get from it that we can apply to our lives, but again, we need to, as this slide shows, it's a quote from How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, Understanding Hermeneutics and Exegesis. We need to first understand what it meant to the early readers, and that what it meant to them should be what it means today. Yeah. So if we don't apply this same hermeneutic, then we end up coming up with all kinds of crazy things like what we see when we talk about the book of Revelation. Hopefully, as we do this study, we're going to do some real exegesis and we're going to allow the Bible to interpret itself. Now, I want to give you a quote from St. Augustine, which says that the new is in the old concealed and the old is in the new revealed. Now, my question is, do we really believe this? And especially when it comes to the book of Revelation. There are over 490, probably even over 500 quotes and allusions to the Tanakh, or what we Christians would call the Old Testament, in the book of Revelation alone. The next thing I want to briefly touch on is a covenant, and essentially it's an agreement. It's a binding agreement, usually a legally binding agreement. I want to remind you that our Bible has been divided into two sections, the Tanakh and the New Testament. And in both sections, we got people making binding agreements between themselves and our creator. Now, something we need to consider is what were or are the consequences for obeying or adhering to those covenant agreements? Or what are the consequences for disobeying and breaking those covenant agreements? And that's a lot of what we're going to see as we go through the book of Revelation. But in order to start, we need to see the covenant lawsuit that began between God and Israel. There were blessings for obedience and there were curses for disobedience. When you read Leviticus 26, you'll find that there are 4 sevenfold judgments. And when you compare those to the riders on the horses in Revelation chapter 6, all of a sudden it starts to make a whole lot more sense. Also, those 4 sevenfold judgments can be found in the book of Revelation in the form of the 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. In Deuteronomy 27, we find that there are promised land curses that are given by the Levites. And if you break those curses, it's not going to end well for you. In Deuteronomy 28, what we find is the covenant lawsuit being reiterated to a younger group of Israelites who are now going into the promised land because the older group of Israelites is going to die off before they get to go in. And this Exodus theme is something we're going to find throughout the New Testament, and especially in the book of Revelation. This whole idea of a second Exodus, a 40-year wandering for the church to reach its goal as well. In Deuteronomy 29, we continue with that renewal, and it's a choice between life and death. And basically, becoming a Christian is a choice between life and death as well. So, what we find in these covenant agreements is when you break them, like the 10 northern tribes did, that the Assyrians come in and God pronounces judgment through them, and they end up being assimilated throughout the rest of the Assyrian Empire. And they pretty much become Gentiles after that. And you don't really hear of them, as Dr. Jason Staples does a great job of pointing out. Then you have the southern kingdom, Judah, Benjamin, and those who decided to join them being judged by Babylon, God using Babylon to judge them. But he could not totally divorce them or do away with them because Messiah, Jesus, had to come through the 12 tribes. And then in Ezekiel 14, you're going to find 4 different types of judgments that are missing. And these are famine, plague, wild beasts, and the sword. And these will become very familiar to you as well as we go through the book of Revelation. And you will see these things reiterated. Now, the Song of Moses is something that many people don't take the time to read and see the implications of, but it has an end in mind. And what we're going to look at as we go through this is what end does Deuteronomy 31 and particularly 32, the Song of Moses, have in mind. In 31, he talks about hiding his face from them. When God hides his face from his people, that means he's going to take away the blessings and you're no longer under his protection. He's no longer with you. Then in 34, 24, 31, 24 through 29, there's a promise of disaster coming on Israel in the last days. And then the Song of Moses picks up on that, and we start seeing how this disaster is coming. First of all, they're called a warped and crooked generation, and we see this over and over again in the New Testament, where Jesus calls them that in Matthew 17 and in Luke 9, where Peter says to save yourselves in the first message given on Pentecost from this warped and crooked generation. And then Paul tells the Philippians that they need to shine like stars in the universe in that warped and crooked generation. So there's no doubt about what generation it was. It was that first century generation who was living at the time. As we continue through the Song of Moses, it's again telling us that there's an end coming, and whose end is it? It is Israel's end. And what does it mean by that? The end of Israel as a nation being the people of God. And that's why Jesus talks about in John 3 that you have to be born again to enter the kingdom. It's no longer about flesh and blood being born into the kingdom of God. Now you're going to have to be born again and become a disciple of Jesus to enter that kingdom. In Deuteronomy 32:21, God tells them that they're making them jealous with these idols and stuff that they're having. But he says that he's going to make them jealous and envious by those who are not a people or people of no understanding. We find that quoted in Romans 10:19. So again, there's no doubt which generation this is speaking of. It's the generation of Jesus's time. In Deuteronomy 32:34 through 36, God talks about storing up this vengeance, and it's his. And we find these things quoted in Romans 12 and Hebrews 10 and in 2 Peter 3. So again, there's no doubt as to which generation that is being spoken of here. And then at the end, there's talking about the Gentiles are to rejoice with his people and that God is going to take vengeance for his servants' blood being spilled. And what did Jesus say in Matthew 23 when he was talking to the Pharisees? On you, all the blood from righteous Abel all the way to Zechariah is going to come on this generation. And again, there's no doubt what generation he's talking about because he's speaking to them when he says this. And then we have more quotes of this fulfillment that we'll find in Romans 15 and Revelation 6 with the souls under the altar. And throughout the book of Revelation, going further as it's talking about taking vengeance for the spilling of the blood. So another thing I want us to keep in mind is, when did the old covenant end? So most people would say that it ended at the crucifixion, and if not at the crucifixion, that it surely ended on the day of Pentecost. But 2 Corinthians 3:11, it can be better understood as the old covenant is fading away, not that it was fading away. It's still around at the time that Paul writes Corinthians. And then the Hebrew writer tells us that it was being made obsolete, but it had not passed away. So I guess the question is the old covenant still around today? No, because Hebrews 8:13 goes on to say that it would soon pass away. So there was some event that was coming that would mark the end of the old covenant age, the end that the Bible clearly has in mind, not the end of time, but the end of the old covenant age. All right, so let's look at something in Second Peter here. I'm going to start getting into some of the New Testament things that we'll be considering in the introduction, and we'll try to answer as we go through the book. Second Peter 3:10-12 talks about these elements that are going to melt. And this is the New King James Version, and they're going to go away. And then we're looking forward to new heavens and the new earth in which righteousness dwells. Someone once asked me if I thought that the new heavens and earth were here now. And the answer to that question that I gave him was yes. What I didn't ask him, because of the setting that we were in, is, so do you think that we're still under the old covenant? Because Matthew 5:17-18 talks about not one jot, not one tittle passing from the law until heaven and earth have passed away. So either we should still be practicing old covenant tenets, or we are clearly under the new covenant. I think we know what the answer to that is. So obviously, heaven and earth isn't what we think of as a literal heaven and earth. There's something else that the Bible has in mind when it talks of heaven and earth. And we will get into that once we get into the first chapter. And then especially when we get to chapter 21, where we will deal with this more. But the word that's used for elements, these elements, the heaven and earth that are going to pass away, the word that's used for elements is stocheia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It means elements, rudiments, fundamental principles, letters of the alphabet, heavenly bodies. I want you to see some of the other passages in the New Testament where this is used. Galatians 4:3-9, where it's referring to the Old Testament law and principles. Colossians 2:8-20, where it's also referring to the Old Testament law and principles. And then Hebrews 5:12, referring to those Old Testament elementary truths. So I guess the question is, what is it that was really passing away? Was the literal heaven and earth passing away, or was it the old covenant system that was passing away? Now I want to look at some of the time statement problems that we find in the New Testament. In Matthew 10, Jesus said he would return before his disciples could finish going through the cities of Israel. Now that's definitely a problem if you think that he has not returned yet. In John 21, he tells Peter, hey, if I want him to remain until I come back, what's that to you? Basically, you just follow me. And the question I have is John still around somewhere, or did Jesus actually return at some point in John's lifetime? We have some other passages that talk about a little while. And you'll see it in John 16 and 1 Peter 1:6 and 5:10. In a little while, he's supposed to be coming. Well, in Hebrews 10:37, it says, in a very, very, when you check the Greek, a very, very little while, he who is coming will come and not delay. I don't think almost 2,000 years serves as a very, very little while. In 2 Peter 3, Peter predicts that these scoffers are going to come at some point in the future in the last days. And in Jude, he planned on writing this big explanation and helping us to understand better what's going on. And all of a sudden, he has to stop and cut it short because the time is so short when he's writing the book that he has only has time to give a warning to his audience. Then Jude also gets into that Jesus is going to be coming with angels. This is something that can be found in Zechariah 14. It can also be found in Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians 4. And we will definitely get into what this is referring to once we get into our study of the book of Revelations, even as early as our next one in chapter 1. In Philippians 4:5, James 5:8, 1 Peter 4, we find that the Lord and the end is near. In 1 John, we find that it is the last hour, and by the time we get to Revelation 14, that hour has come. So I know we hear all the time that only God the Father knows the day and the hour and all that. If so, then one of the things we need to understand is he was making it clear through the Spirit that that time was near and that that hour was upon them. And by the time we're into the book of Revelation, it has come. It's arrived. So the appointed time, or Kairos, Revelation 1, verses 1 through 3, was soon and near. And Kairos, again, has more in mind an appointed time than Chronos, which we normally look at as the way we normally keep time. So something that was appointed, maybe going back to Daniel 9, that this was the appointed time, Daniel 12 as well, this being the appointed time for these things to happen, even all the way back to Deuteronomy 32. Wow, what generation was supposed to be the last generation? That was this generation. So the appointed time for that was soon and near. We are told in Revelation 22 that it was to be soon or near at least 5 times. So what this is called an inclusio. So if you begin the book of Revelation with soon and near, and you end the book of Revelation with soon and near, these two things bookend the entire book. And what that tells us is that everything written in the book of Revelation had to occur in that soon and near time frame. So I guess we need to discover when was the book of Revelation written so that we can determine that soon and near time frame. And that's another thing that we're going to do as soon as we begin chapter 1. Here are some problems with the second coming and resurrection. Let me go ahead and put them both on there. First of all, with 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 4, where Paul tells them they don't need to be concerned about Jesus coming back, and anyone who tells you that, you don't need to listen to him. Well, first of all, the book of 2 Thessalonians is written in the early 50s, and the destruction of Jerusalem didn't occur until AD 70. But my big question with this is if the second coming is this big eye-popping event where every eye is going to see him, why would the Thessalonians have thought that he had already returned? Why is Paul having to tell them to, hey guys, relax, take it easy? No, he hasn't come back yet. If the second coming is this, Jesus coming on the clouds, visibly seen by all, that's what it is. I don't think anyone would have a problem determining whether or not he had come. Yet here with the Thessalonians, we find Paul's having to reassure them that no, he has not come yet. So maybe our understanding of what the second coming is all about isn't quite as accurate as we think it is. And mine was that way for many, many years as well. And then in Second Timothy, where Hymenaeus and Philetus have convinced others that the resurrection has occurred. Now, wait a minute. If we got bodies popping up out of the ground for everybody to see, I don't think there's going to be any doubt as to when the resurrection has occurred. But yet it says that Hymenaeus and Philetus has shipwrecked the faith of some. So obviously, there is more than one type of resurrection going on in the New Testament as well. And we will get into those as we go through. I'd say there's probably 3 different types of resurrection. And again, as we go through the book of Revelation, we will get into that more. I believe it's around chapter 7, but as well as, of course, chapter 20. Okay, so let's get into this generation now. In Matthew 1, we're shown the generations leading up to Jesus's birth. In Matthew 23, that I've already alluded to or talked about, it was to be that generation that was to be judged that is coming. And this is that same generation in Matthew 24:34 as well. It's the same generation. In Matthew 11, where we're told that John is the Elijah to come, and it was in that generation as well, not in some future generation. And at the transfiguration, it was also reiterated that John was the Elijah to come before the end. Before the end of what? Before the end of the old covenant age, as Malachi makes that very clear. And then in Acts 2:39, it differentiates between this generation, that generation at that time, and those of us who are far off, like maybe ourselves. Now, far off could possibly mean the Gentiles. So maybe this one is not as good a one as it could be, but I'm still going to leave it in there as a possibility of differentiating between that generation and those of us today. Now, signs of the end of the age. When you read Matthew 24 and all that apocalyptic language, it's no wonder people can make stuff up because we don't read our Old Testament the way that we should, so we don't understand what's going on. So we make up all kinds of crazy things. And then in Mark 13, it is very clear that it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But if you really want to understand it, go to Luke, because Luke is that written for the Gentile audience. So we don't have to guess what all the symbols and things are about. He's weeping over the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And then in Luke 21, he says it as plainly as can be. He tells them what they're going to go through, when they need to leave the city. He gives the what and why of why this will happen to Jerusalem. So there's no doubt in Luke 21 that it's about the destruction of Jerusalem. So if you are confused as to the Matthew 24 or even the Mark 13, read the Luke 21 version. It's going to clear up all the confusion. It's about the destruction of Jerusalem. I've already hinted that some people will be alive at his coming. The Matthew 10 one, we've already gone over. John being alive at his coming, we've already gone over. Then Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15 that most of the witnesses of his resurrection were still living, but some had fallen asleep or had died. And the only reason why I'm putting this in is to point out what Paul means by sleep. And then later on in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that we, those who were present in Paul's lifetime, will not sleep or die before he comes. So again, it's another statement that they be alive at his coming. And then in Thessalonians, if this is all one thought, we like to read the First Thessalonians 4 thing, and this is about the rapture, or this is about the future coming of Jesus. But you go all the way through chapter 5 and you see it's one thought. And what's going on here is that some of them would be alive at his coming, as we see in chapter 4. And this would be in chapter 5, as it points out, when the people are crying, peace and safety, just like when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. So there would still be some of the Christians alive at the time of his coming, which is the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, why are you saying that the time of his coming is the destruction of Jerusalem? Because we all know he's going to be coming on the clouds. We'll get into it in the first chapter, but I'll go ahead and tell you now. In the Tanakh or the Old Testament, whenever God came on the clouds, you will see that it meant he was sending a nation in judgment on another nation. He sent nations in judgment on Babylon. He sent nations in judgment on Edom. He sent nations in judgment on the 10 northern tribes, and he sent nations in judgment on Jerusalem itself. So you will see that anytime God comes on the clouds in the Old Testament, that he is sending a nation in judgment against another nation. That's what the people understood, the Pharisees, the high priests, and all that, when they had Jesus on trial. They understood he was saying, number one, he was God and saying he would be coming on the clouds. And number two, that he would be sending, they knew at that time they were there on the Roman occupation, that it was probably going to be the Romans that he was going to send to judge and destroy them. And they were not having it. Okay, getting back to this, we need to be Bereans who examine the scriptures, and that's why I was looking for people who really want to study the scriptures with me and not come in with a bunch of preconceived notions, but who want to sit down and examine the scriptures to see what they have to say so that we can all hopefully reach unity by the time we're done with the study. I've done this twice before, and I think those who have gone through it have been challenged by it, but have definitely come to an understanding that they did not have before. Okay, again, in conclusion, we have to make an effort to understand first what it meant to them, and then we can apply some of the ways that we can use the scriptures today. There was a covenantal agreement between God and Israel that was spelled out in these chapters. Disobedient led to things like the book of Judges, the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. And then the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy predicted the end for Israel. And that end was the end of the old covenant age as well, which did not end at the cross or with Jesus' resurrection or Pentecost, but with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's when heaven and earth passed away. Read Josephus 3, Antiquities 3. I can't remember which specific area it is, but if you read through there, there's the heading about the temple, and you will see that he called that heaven and earth. The old covenant system, not the elements of the universe, was going to be destroyed at Jesus' second coming. This is what I pointed out when we went through the Second Peter stuff and the heaven and earth stuff as well. There are time statement passages that indicate a first century return of Jesus, and that some people will be alive to see it. You can't get away from the time statement. All right, and another thing here is that the second coming and resurrection is the problems we have. They may not be the things that we have been taught that they are. So another conclusion, and I believe this might be my final one, is that first century Israel was going to be judged at his coming for breaking the covenant and rejecting Jesus as Messiah. What further rejection of God could there be than to reject his son, whom he sent to save him? I hope you have enjoyed this study, and I look forward to seeing you when we begin. I hope this has built your curiosity for those of you who are still on the fence as to whether or not to join me for this study. And for those of you who had already decided to join me, I hope this gives you more of a desire to join and go through the book of Revelation and discover what it is that it's really talking about. I look forward to seeing you in the first study where we will determine the date for the book and set the course for the rest of the journey. Thank you. And again, I look forward to seeing you in that study.